Today is February 27th. Welcome to Big Book Daily. My name is Rob. I am an alcoholic. It is a thrill, honor, and joy to be here with you today as we journey through the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous and the 12 Steps and 12 Traditions. Today we're going to be reading AA number 3 out of the Pioneers of AA. We're going to be reading pages 182 through 184. And out of the 12 and 12, we're going to be reading a little bit more about Step 7, the second half of page 75. So with all that, my friends, let's get right to it. Alright, so if you'll recall from the Pioneers of AA, the testimonies that we read here in the Pioneers, these are all men that were obviously in the early days of AA that died sober. So as they're telling their testimonies here, they're sober and they have lasting sobriety. So AA number 3 was a guy named Bill Dotson. At his death, he did not have a drink in more than 19 years. Yeah, his sobriety date was June 26th, 1935. So much like Dr. Bob, hopefully we can look for some similarities here and see his experience, strength, and hope. All right, let's get to it. Page 182, Alcoholics Anonymous number 3. Pioneer member of Akron Group number 1, the first AA group in the world. He kept the faith, therefore he and countless others found a new life. One of 5 children, I was born on a Kentucky farm in Carlisle County. My parents were well-to-do people, and their marriage was a happy one. My wife, a Kentucky girl, came with me to Akron where I completed my course in law at the Akron Law School. My case is rather unusual in one respect. There were no childhood episodes of unhappiness to account for my alcoholism. I had, seemingly, just a natural affinity for grog. My marriage was happy. And I never had any of the reasons, conscious or unconscious, which are often given for drinking. Yet, as my record shows, I did become an extremely serious case. Before my drinking had cut me down completely, I achieved a considerable measure of success, having been a city councilman for 5 years and a financial director of a suburb later taken into the city itself. But of course, this all went down the drain with my increased drinking. So, at the time Dr. Bob and Bill came along, I had about run out my strength. The first time I became intoxicated, I was 8 years old. This was no fault of my father or mother, as they were both very much opposed to drinking. A couple of hired hands were cleaning out the barn on the farm, and I was riding to and from on the sled, and while they were loading, I drank hard cider out of a barrel in the barn. On the return trip, after 2 or 3 loads, I passed out and had to be carried to the house. I remember that my father kept whiskey around the house for medical purposes and entertainment. And I would drink from this when no one was about, and then water it to keep my parents from knowing I was drinking. This continued until I enrolled in our state university, and at the end of 4 years, I realized that I was a drunk. Morning after morning, I awoke sick with terrible jitters. But there was always a flask of liquor sitting on the table beside my bed. I would reach over and get this and take a shot, and in a few moments get up and take another, shave, eat my breakfast, slip half a pint of liquor into my hip pocket, and then go to school. Between classes, I would run down to the washroom, take enough to steady my nerves, and then go on to the next class. This was in 1917. I left the university in the latter part of my senior year and enlisted in the Army. At the time, I called it patriotism. Later, I realized that I was running from alcohol. It did help to a certain extent, since I found myself in places where I could not obtain anything to drink, and so broke the habitual drinking. Then Prohibition came into effect, and the facts that the stuff obtainable was so horrible and sometimes deadly, and that I had married and had a job which I had to look after, it helped me for a period of some 3 or 4 years, although I would get drunk every time I could get hold of enough drink to get started. My wife and I belonged to some bridge clubs, and they began to make wine and serve it. However, after 2 or 3 trials, I found this was not satisfactory because they did not serve enough to satisfy me, so I would refuse to drink. This problem was soon solved, however, as I began to take my bottle along with me and hide it in the bathroom or in the shrubbery outside. As time went on, my drinking became progressively worse. I would be away from my office 2 or 3 weeks at a time. As time went on, my drinking became progressively worse. I would be away from my office 2 or 3 weeks at a time. Horrible days and nights when I would lie on the floor of my home and reach over to get the bottle, take a drink, and then go back into oblivion. All right, guys, on that dark note, we will stop here. We'll come back to this in just a second. All right, everybody. So in the 12 and 12, we've been learning about step 7 for quite some time, and it's humbly asked him to remove our shortcomings. We spent a big chunk of the chapter reading about humility and why it's a necessity, but we also talked about the newfound peace and all the things that are gained when we start to practice humility in our lives by taking a square look at some of our defects, discussing them with others, and becoming willing to have them removed. So we're going to continue that thought on 75, where we're going to finish off this page today. During this process of learning more about humility, the most profound result of all was the change in our attitude toward God. And this was true whether we had been believers or unbelievers. We began to get over the idea that the higher power was a sort of Bush League pinch hitter, to be called upon only in an emergency. The notion that we would still live our own lives, God helping a little now and then, began to evaporate. Many of us who had thought ourselves religious awoke to the limitations of this attitude. Refusing to place God first, we had deprived ourselves of His help. But now the words, "Of myself I am nothing, the Father doeth the works," began to carry bright promise and meaning. We saw we needn't always be bludgeoned and beaten into humility. It could come quite as much from our voluntary reaching for it as it could from unremitting suffering. A great turning point in our lives came when we sought for humility as something we really wanted, rather than something we must have. It marked the time when we could commence to see full implication of step 7, humbly asked Him to remove our shortcomings. All right, my friends, I absolutely love the line right here. During this process of learning more about humility, the most profound result of all was the change in our attitude toward God. I can actually relate to that. I've had to change my attitude toward God. I think I had put the God of my understanding in a box, and He was very much after man's image, and very legalistic, narrow-minded, angry. I'm going to get you. I know what you did. That kind of God. And that certainly didn't work for me. And having more of an open mind and practicing these suggestions and everything, I learned, at least for me, that my God is a patient, loving, caring God. And He's a very active God. A very active God. You know, like the 12:12 says here, the notion that we would still live our own lives, God helping a little now and then, began to evaporate. He's active in everything that I'm doing throughout the day. I know I still have the freedom of choice, but He does change my attitude and my perspective. And I am a lot more grateful now than I was while I was drinking. And I think that's because I realized that the God of my understanding He's in control and I'm not. And there's so many things that He's blessed me with right in front of me, if I just am willing enough to see it. And going back to the big book, I'm glad he brings up his childhood. Not everybody has to have something absolutely traumatic happen to them for them to cause them to drink. I have heard from many friends that have said, I actually had a great childhood. There was nothing really wrong. It can be as simple as you just put the alcohol in your system and it's off to the races. I've heard many stories like that, and I'm grateful that that's there. So yeah, we can see that his progression into alcoholism is getting much, much stronger. I mean, he's drinking for oblivion now. And once again, we know that this has a happy ending, so just stay tuned for that. All right, that's all we have for today, my friends. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here in this lifeboat of recovery. As I try to say in every episode, I am not speaking on behalf of AA, Al-Anon, NA. I'm just a guy. I'm just a man in recovery. I love these two books, and I'm reading this for my own accountability. And I hope that maybe it's helping somebody else out there just to hear this stuff as well. I hope you all have a great day, and I am looking forward to seeing you back here tomorrow.